We're extremely fortunate to host Julia tonight, and I thank one of the best board members we've ever had at the Library Society, David Cohen, for putting us in touch. When David was Dean of the School of Languages, Culture, and World Affairs at the College of Charleston, he met Julia and has followed her spectacular career as a diehard fan. When he learned that she had a new book coming out, he immediately suggested we try to get her to Charleston. I wish that our COVID numbers were good enough that she'd been able to come in person as we had hoped. But David assures me that she loves Charleston, our restaurant scene, so I fully intend to lure her back. It's hard to imagine anyone more fitting to spend time at our second oldest circulating library in America than someone of her stature. Julia is a New York Times bestselling author, scholar, and entrepreneur. During her long, successful career at a Washington think tank, she has demonstrated the ability to synthesize and communicate complex foreign policy and historical issues, making them accessible without sacrificing substance. She's been a popular primetime guest on CBS, NBC, ABC, CNN, you name it. She's been there, even Comedy Central's Colbert Report. She served as a senior fellow at the Council on Foreign Relations for 15 years and concurrently led the Aspen Institute's Congressional Seminar on Latin America for 10 years. Her writing has appeared in the New York Times, the Atlantic, the Washington Post, again, any reputable paper, magazine she has written for. She is a senior research fellow at the LBJ School of Public Affairs at the University of Texas, Austin, and the creator, host, and executive producer of the podcast series currently under development, In Plain Sight. Her book, Inside the Cuban Revolution, won the American Historical Association's 2003 Herbert Feist Award. And I've been told that at one point, and she may still hold the record for the longest interview ever held with Fidel Castro. So we know she has tenacity too. Tonight, we welcome her to discuss her book, Lady Bird Johnson, Hiding in Plain Sight, which is the first to draw substantially on Lady Bird's own voice from her White House diaries. Like another compelling writer, David McCullough, who used Abigail Adams' letters and diaries to showcase a robust story of a power couple, Julia captivates her reader by using Lady Bird's revelations to share the story of a woman ahead of her time and an accomplished politician in her own right, which I certainly never anticipated. We are in for a treat, so please welcome Julia.
Well, thank you, Anne, for that lovely introduction, and thanks to all of you for coming. I'm really delighted to be with you, even though I'm not with you in Charleston. Now, am I to wait, Laura, or should I start?
You could begin, but I'm going to
okay.
really quickly mention that
Okay.
we're going to post in the chat a chance for you to be able to link to Julia's books. You could purchase Hiding in Plain Sight through Buxton Books, which is our on-campus bookstore here at the Charleston Library Society. They have copies that are that include signed book plates by Julia. You can also email or paste in the chat any questions that you would have. We're going to begin with Julia's lecture, and then that's going to be followed by Q&A. So please send along your questions that you'd like to ask in the chat. Julia, take it away.
Well, thank you. Let me just change there we go. All right, well, thank you again for having me. Thanks everybody for joining. I've been really pleased to get to know Charleston just a tiny bit. And when I first met David Cohen and Claudia, who I hope I'll see on the screen sometime tonight, they extolled the wonders of this institution, and I've gotten to know it just a tiny bit, and I really thank you for the invitation and the warm welcome. I, as Anne mentioned, have a background that doesn't suggest that I would have landed on the topic of Lady Bird Johnson or first ladies or even the American presidency. I have spent 15 years working in foreign policy and writing about Latin America and also about Cuba, though I don't think the longest recorded interview with Fidel Castro, although several. But I want to explain to you how I got to this topic because it's such a different pivot for me. And that was because after working in foreign policy and in Latin America, I had the need to look more broadly at the theme of women and power. And for two reasons. One, in Latin America, women were starting to become heads of state, something that hasn't happened here in the United States yet. But two, in foreign policy circles, I spent many, many years as often the only woman in the room. And there was something that just was grating to me about that experience and wanting to kind of go outside myself to a little bit to look at that theme more broadly of how women navigate power and power relations and the dynamic of power. And it wasn't until I discovered that Lady Bird Johnson kept this vast record of her experience while she was in the White House that I decided that she would be the vehicle for me to get into these topics. So really, she found me. And I'll say a little bit about who she was and the primary source material that allowed me to write this book. She was a journalism and history major when she was in college at the University of Texas in Austin. That's the first thing to know about her, maybe not the first, but one very important facet of her. So that well before she reached the White House, as she was involved in building Lyndon Johnson's career, especially once she became, beginning, I would say, with his first Senate campaign, a very vital component of his political team, she started recording on these tiny little notebooks in shorthand everything that was happening in their political lives, including leading up to that day in Dallas. Now I'm fast forwarding, November 22nd, 1963, which is the first recording she left. She records on a reel-to-reel of what became a 5-year, 123-hour record of her time in the White House. Now, even on the Air Force One coming back from Dallas, she had the presence of mind to pull out one of those little notebooks and take notes about what she had just experienced. Often we hear about LBJ, Lyndon Johnson's tapes, his secret tapes. I think of these tapes, the other LBJ and her tapes. So now we have two LBJs, one of whom recorded tapes secretly, the other one who did it quite openly, but they both did it because they were compulsive about documenting their experience in the White House. She, because of her training, and also because I think she understood from the very beginning, because of how they came into power, that it would be quite a number of decades until their presidency could be fully digested and appreciated by historians and journalists and American citizens. And I think that's what's happened. So the material itself is vital and it is riveting. And we produced also a podcast based on it so you can hear Lady Bird's voice telling her own story. And what that material reveals is a woman of incredible power, significant influence, on whom Lyndon Johnson relied for judgment and strategic advice as probably the most influential member, I would argue, of his administration during his presidency. There were lots of surprises to me, and I'll just sketch out some of them for you. It's not, and I should say, not just the tapes that undergird this story, but also because of her commitment to documenting everything. the material that pertains to Lady Bird Johnson's East Wing and the office of the First Lady when she was in the White House, and her numerous policy initiatives, that material at the LBJ library is vast. And she was, with her staff as LBJ, quite committed to making sure that the historical record was left there. So I say surprises because I'll confess to you that when I got into this work, my take on Lady Bird was kind of superficial. You know, she seemed like a stuffy Southern lady, traditional president's wife, very, very coiffed, very, very controlled, at Lyndon's side, but not necessarily somebody who struck me as having power or her own policy agenda or the kind of ambition she has revealed in this material. So when I say surprised, I was very surprised, and I think you will be too. The clues to her significance and ambition came up quite early on, that is, early in the chronology of their time in the presidency. The first one, I need to just make an adjustment on my screen if you don't mind. The first one I discovered in a folder, which was described in the library as letters, Mrs. Johnson to President Johnson. And inside of this, what I discovered was a document which I have taken the liberty of renaming and calling it the Huntlin Strategy Memo. It's a document that she wrote on May 14th, 1964, and it's a 9-page handwritten memorandum. Not a letter, dear Lyndon, love Lady Bird, although it does start that way and ends that way. In the content, what she reveals is her awareness of how very tenuous LBJ's standing threatened to become, even though as they looked ahead to the 1964 presidential election. In May of 1964, LBJ was miserable, and he was worried that even if he ran and won, he wouldn't be able to hold the country together. He was insecure. He was very sensitive to the scrutiny and the criticism by the Northeastern elite and media of his sort of corn-pone, hick Southern ways. I'm using those words because those were the words that we used at the time. And he was also aware, with his Secretary of Defense, Bob McNamara, and the entire Vietnam War Council, whom he had kept on board after the Kennedy assassination. McNamara had gone to Vietnam 5 times since JFK's assassination. And he was pushing, as were Bundy and the other team, LBJ to escalate in Vietnam. Lady Bird and Lyndon understood in their bones that they didn't understand Vietnam and that they were not going to be able to resist the pull of escalation for lots of reasons that we can get into. So he's looking at Vietnam, and the second thing they're looking at has to do with their domestic policy ambitions, civil rights, the war on poverty, the Great Society. All of these were not yet a reality in May of 1964. Civil rights was stuck in the Congress. The war on poverty legislation hadn't passed yet. He hadn't given his Great Society speech in Ann Arbor. It all looked very muddy and murky. So he asked Lady Bird to write out her view of the pros and cons of whether, in fact, he should actually run in November of 1964. And that's what this memorandum is. And it is significant because it shows how much he valued her, her strategic thinking, their awareness of Vietnam, the tenuousness that they felt despite the sort of moment where they could see that they might well win in the fall of 65. And she writes out this pro and con memo, and she says to him, look, you're too young to get out of the arena, and I don't want to go back to the ranch and see you drink too much and you'll be miserable and I'll be miserable. You should run in the fall of this coming year and you'll very likely win. And then, and this is crucial. She says, but then in February or March of 1968, you can announce to the world and to the country that you won't be standing for a second term. And of course, that's precisely what he does. On March 31st, 1968, LBJ gives a Sunday 9:00 p.m. press conference and shocks almost everyone in his staff and the whole Washington punditry and the country, saying that he won't be running again. And of course, the spin ever since, in the immediate aftermath and in all of the history that's been written until my book, has been that this was because of Vietnam, it was because of Bobby Kennedy, it was because of Eugene McCarthy. And all of those were clearly, you can do the counterfactual and think, well, if all of those had been going his way, maybe who would walk away from power? Certainly not Lyndon Johnson, but he and his wife had been following a path, the arc of which she had set 4 years earlier when he made that announcement. And I take a little bit of time in the book and tonight to describe this to you because it totally blew my mind. It completely flips the script on that defining moment of his presidency when he says, I'm not going to do this anymore. And it shows her prescience and his reliance on her for that kind of candor and counsel. The second kind of big surprise for me in this book, and here I guess this is because I was less educated about American history before I started writing the book than I feel that I might be now. But the second big surprise was how a woman who was from East Texas and had spent her summers in Alabama could come out of that experience as such a progressive when it came to civil rights and social justice. And a woman, of course, of significant economic means as well. She and LBJ felt when they came to the White House, I should say, that they were fulfilling what was left to be done that FDR and Eleanor hadn't completed. They were New Deal Democrats, and the problem of civil rights and racial apartheid in the United States and in the South was top of mind for them. And so I was very surprised how skilled she was in terms of the timing of when she revealed just what an advocate she was for civil rights. And so you see this in 1964, and you see her awareness that before the Civil Rights Act passed in July of 64, for example, she came to the South, she went to Alabama to tout the space program, to tout the economic benefits of the New South that the Democratic Party would bring. But it wasn't until the legislation was passed that she then, takes off another layer and campaigns through eight states, 42 stops over 4 days in October of 1964 on a whistle stop tour, which is the first time that a first lady has campaigned by herself without her husband in a presidential campaign. So the woman that revealed herself then was just enormously impressive. She was receiving death threats along the route. It became she didn't feel, I think, directly threatened, but the Secret Service had to send out dummy trains and helicopters and dog sniffers, and the crowds were stuffed with white supremacist groups, and the taunts were quite aggressive. And what that revealed to me was just her incredible tenacity and her values around not just approaching civil rights as a kind of moral crusade, but she really believed that the South shouldn't be left behind and that the South had the potential to come around. She also understood in her bones the backlash that the Democratic Party was likely to experience and did experience around civil rights. and nevertheless campaigned because she didn't want to leave the South. She didn't want to abandon the South by default in the 1964 presidential election, is the way she put it. The third component of surprise, and I'll speak a little bit about this one and then say something about Vietnam before we open it up to Q&A. The third component of surprise to me has to do with what for her entire life and since, and especially during her presidency, was described as beautification, her environmentalism, and really what was behind that. The phrase beautification she hated. She thought it was very prissy. It obviously has that kind of feminized, superficial feeling to it and air to it, and she was aware of that. But underneath that that word, behind that word, was a very sophisticated environmentalism and an ambitious way of trying to think not just about beautifying highways, but about American cities and about how to guarantee democratic access to nature in urban settings in the United States of America. This was in the early 1960s, 1964, 65, coming on the heels of two big infrastructure developments, and I think that's relevant to today, from the 1940s and 50s. One of them was the interstate highway system, which in the 1950s put hundreds and hundreds of millions of dollars into building our internet in our highway system. But at the same time, when highways were built, they were done without really any regard for the environment, without regard for aesthetics. That's why billboards and junkyards were popped up in an unregulated way around them, but also in the entrances and exits to cities that highways were connected to, they often wound up bulldozing very vulnerable communities, mostly communities of color. So that was one component that was sort of in her gray matter, or actually not her gray matter, very conscious of this as she was pushing for something around that became highway beautification. But the second has to do with urban renewal. Urban renewal programs in the 1940s and 50s, another big infrastructure project, wound up putting a lot of money into developers' hands. And the effect of this was to eliminate, again, to raise in RAZE in 300 communities around the country, many poor communities where the conditions were substandard, but by eliminating them and replacing them often with urban highways, you've probably seen some reporting about this, about Rochester and about New Orleans. And certainly we had a near miss here in Washington, DC, but around the country, urban renewal was also something that had displaced communities and sort of got to the question of access to resources, nature, public recreation for communities of color in American cities. Those were the two problems she was trying to solve for. And so the ornamental aspect of beautification that we see in Washington, DC, for example, with the blooms every spring, was one piece of it. It was sort of a strategic way to do something nice for Washington, DC, to bring in the financial support from philanthropists that she needed, for example, to fund that kind of thing, but also to raise consciousness in the country and in Washington, DC, around this marrying of civil rights and access to nature. Washington, DC was the Johnsons' home for 30 years by the time they got into the White House. It was the largest majority Black city in the country at the time, and one that had no representation in Congress. They were big backers of what at the time was called home rule. And Lady Bird was able, which is now the statehood movement. And so Lady Bird was able to team up with some very innovative landscape architects and activists from around the country, bring them to Washington, DC, and develop a way to mobilize. This never happened, so I'm speaking about a plan, but there are these gorgeous, extensive plans that exist because of her championing of them to build beautiful public park systems along the Anacostia River in Southwest and Southeast and Northeast DC, which are the Black parts of this city, or were at the time. So that very much surprised me, that she was so multi-layered and sophisticated in thinking about what humans in American cities needed to feel fully human. I want to talk about a little bit about Vietnam. To my mind, Vietnam is Lady Bird's blind spot. She was pretty thoughtful and pretty sophisticated most of the time about many things, starting with her husband's presidency. But about Vietnam, she shared his blinders. And that in part was twofold. One, they had grown up during World War II, politically speaking. And the idea that the United States would betray an ally was unthinkable to them in the middle of the geopolitics of the Cold War. But they also weren't really on very solid foreign policy ground. They didn't have a lot of experience other than when Lyndon was vice president traveling around the world, but they weren't foreign policy people. They were domestic policy people. So they were sort of weak on that front. The second is where they did sort of tie the two together was they were American exceptionalists. They had this Wilsonian idea that we ought to be able to reproduce who we are at home and what we do at home abroad. So if you can deliver electricity to poor people in Texas, as Lyndon did, why not do that in the Mekong Delta? So that idealism actually was real for them. And it really wasn't until her own two children got married to men who were getting ready to deploy to Vietnam, and she started also meeting at the White House very quietly with injured veterans, people who had lost 1 and 2 and 3 limbs, who were coming to the White House, and Lady Bird was meeting with them. And when she went outside of Washington to try to promote her environmental agenda, the protest movement completely drowned her out. So by 1967, those 3 dimensions of Vietnam come to a head, and that is when she picks up the mantle again of pushing LBJ to identify the time and the place and the substance of his statement to tell the country that he won't be running again. And that is precisely what happens. And there's some fits and starts before it happens. But by the beginning of 1968, she's 100% clear that she doesn't want to see him in office again. She's worried about his health too. This is a man who had had a heart attack at 55 years old in 1955 that almost killed him. His father and brother also died of heart failure, and he was just a few years away from 60. So the book, just to wrap this up so I can take your questions and talk with you, the book plays out over the course of 1968. There's some really incredible material about how Lady Bird and Lyndon, but especially Lady Bird, dealt with the assassinations of Martin Luther King and Bobby Kennedy, about her relationship with Jackie Kennedy. And, you know, by the time she left the White House, she had started to count the days. She was ready to go, had no interest whatsoever in staying. Lyndon, after Bobby Kennedy's assassination, some of you may remember, kind of toys with, well, you know, maybe at the Chicago Convention in 1968, they'll recruit me and I'll just twist my arm, maybe have to stay. But he too was ready to go. They had become grandparents, and they were looking forward to getting back to Texas. So I'll wrap it up there, and please just jump in or tell Laura and Anne your questions, and they can we can have a conversation.
Julie, that was fantastic. Thank you so much. I loved hearing this. It sounds like you discovered really significant surprises in your research. We have some questions, but please do send more. I think there's a lot to discuss here. I didn't introduce myself earlier, but I'm Laura Mina. I'm the head librarian at the Charleston Library Society, and I have some of my own questions, but I do have some questions from the audience. First of all, it's one of the things that you mentioned was her relationship with Jackie Kennedy. She was on the plane on Air Force One with Jackie Kennedy immediately following the assassination. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Well, I want to talk a little bit, not just about Air Force One, but about the relationship between Jackie and Lady Bird, because that is another element that surprised me. You know, there was such trash talking of the Johnsons by the Kennedy crowd, and that kind of filtered into the future from the early 1960s. And there's been lots of nasty books and sort of rumors and gossip, and part of that is attributed to Jackie. So I was very surprised to see that in the 1950s and leading up until the 1960 campaign, and then when Lady Bird was second lady and Jackie first, Jackie and Lady Bird had a very solid relationship. And the script sort of flipped in 1960, but until 1960, when Lady Bird was the wife of the Senate Majority Leader and Jackie was new to town, Lady Bird sort of used her magnanimity and her seniority to try to bring Jackie in. They weren't very close at the time, but by 1960, when Jack asked LBJ to join the presidential ticket, Jackie is dealing with miscarriages. Lady Bird is a full-blown member of the Johnson political team by then. And so there's this wonderful moment when they go to Hyannis in 1960 to launch the campaign season. And Jackie cannot get her head around Lady Bird. She describes her as a trained hunting dog. She says, I can't understand how a spouse, how a wife, what is this thing that's going on between them? Lady Bird was, of course, with her 360 intelligence, taking notes on the one hand and about Lyndon's conversation across the room and chatting with the ladies on the other side of the room. Jackie couldn't make that compute. But as second lady, you know, Jackie was kind of miserable in the White House, is my take. And so she asked Lady Bird essentially to continue what Lady Bird did during the campaign, which is she campaigned all over the country. She campaigned as Jackie's surrogate, Jack's surrogate, Lyndon's surrogate, schlepped her sisters-in-law and Rose Kennedy all over the South to try to diffuse the anti-Catholic bias. Lady Bird was just a gamer, and she was comfortable on the rope line. Jackie sort of hated it. So in the White House, when Jackie didn't want to sort of do all that ceremonial stuff, she asked Lady Bird to do it, and Lady Bird always stepped up. I'm giving you all of that background because in Dallas and on the airplane and in the 14 days of transition between the assassination and Jackie moving out of the White House with her kids and the Johnsons moving in, the two of them execute this incredibly tender and careful transition. They are so delicate and careful with one another. It's all in public. It's incredibly painful. I mean, you can imagine Lady Bird doesn't expect to be able to fill Jackie's shoes. She knows how different the two of them are. But the woman's just had her husband assassinated in her lap. And Lady Bird is 100% empathy. So those 14 days are pretty beautiful, I would say. And then the relationship kind of deteriorates once Jackie leaves Washington. It goes to a really dark place that I describe at Bobby Kennedy's funeral at St. Patrick's Cathedral in 1968. But the beautiful thing is that the two of them recover their relationship and they start getting together in the 1980s in Martha's Vineyard every summer. And Lady Bird travels to Jackie's funeral when she dies in, I think it's 1994 or 5. So it's a very long trajectory between the two of them.
That's really powerful. I think, I'm curious about that scene in St. Patrick's Cathedral. I'd be very curious to hear like what all the bumps and experiences were in that arc of their friendship.
You can hear it on the podcast. The podcast has been produced. It's on wherever you listen to podcasts. Just look up In Plain Sight, Lady Bird Johnson, and you can hear Lady Bird describe her experience watching Leonard Bernstein conduct Mahler, seeing Jackie, dealing with Jackie's hostility, the whole thing. It's all there, and it's all in audio, so I recommend it. You can also read it in my book. I
put the link for the podcast in the chat.
Oh, good.
So folks
Okay, thank you.
Grab that. Absolutely, it's incredible. So speaking of which, you talked about her empathy, Lady Bird's empathy. Going into her personality a little bit more. There's a question, curiosity-wise, what led Lady Bird and Lyndon to marry, and what kind of a wife was she? What kind of a mother was she, outside of her gaming?
Well, the story of their courtship is kind of wild. They have a first date in 1934, and at the end of the date, LBJ asks her to marry him. He's no dummy. He could spot a smart, well-read woman of means who was, she was educated, and she was low ego, and I don't know that he knew this, but she already had experience dealing with large personalities. She was left, her mother died when she was 5 years old, and she was raised by her larger than life father and nannies and an aunt. She thought he was nuts, but she described herself as a moth going to the flame, and they started this just frenetic letter writing over 6 weeks, and phone calls. Long distance phone call used to be very expensive, but Lyndon was calling. He was working as a congressional aide in Washington at the time, and he would call her house in Karnak, Texas, and drive from Washington to see her. And their letters, I think, they haven't been published, but they're all public. So it was a very heady romance for the two of them. And then one day he showed up unannounced at her home, her family home, and said, "Now or never." And they went and basically eloped and got married with a couple of friends as witnesses in a church in San Antonio. And that was that. And, she wrote to a friend, "I've just committed matrimony." So she was funny too. I think being married to Lyndon Johnson must have just been totally exhausting, and really, it was a long marriage. They were married for 30 years by the time they celebrated their 30th anniversary, the first year they were in the White House. I think she really must have realized early on that there was no way she could possibly be all things to this man, and he was a political animal, and there was a lot of license for Washington political animals to have relationships outside of the marriage, and that he did. And his infidelity and his vulgarity was offensive, and I'm sure offensive to her. But what I've surmised from the totality of and the layers of the marriage is that because he was also so, especially by the time they got into the White House, where she had learned to deal with his depression and help him manage it, his dependence on her was total. And she thrived off of knowing how much he needed her. And because her ambitions were so in line with his in terms of the country and what was possible, I think there was just a lot of power that she derived from being his spouse. I mean, I don't think so. It's totally evident to me. A woman in 1960, 61, 62, 63 couldn't get her own credit card, had to have her husband co-sign a lease. There were lots of opportunities that being his wife afforded her that most other women in the country just didn't have access to. And I'm not even talking about sitting in bed with the Joint Chiefs looking at bombing targets, or the kind of like deep policy dive that she was doing all the time. But that was a big part of it as well. So let me just say, because I want to answer this question thoroughly, what kind of mother she was. I didn't interview the daughters, but what is clear from what happens once they get into the White House is it's a little bit like what you heard the Obamas talk about. Once everybody's under one roof and they're not running out and doing sort of Washington kabuki social life at 4 nights a week and leaving the kids with a babysitter, the 2 teenage girls are under one roof. And Lady Bird writes all the time about how lovely it is to have access to them and to just go snuggle and hear their boy problems and just, hang out and have them help her deal with Lyndon. And there was it was an opportunity to make up for lost time, frankly.
Wow. So it sounds like she had a very close relationship with her daughters. And did she have a close relationship with her grandchildren eventually?
Oh, well, yes. I mean, the grandchildren adore her. And you can see that if you watch her memorial service, where many of them speak. But one of the wonderful things about her post-presidency is that she traveled all over the world with them and all over the country. And there are many of them. And she had a big travel bug all her life and mostly couldn't scratch it, or, you're mixing metaphors there. But, she was able to get out into the world quite a bit with both her daughters and her grandchildren. They called her Nini.
Hmm. Well, I think we've talked a lot about like her draw to power and her, her natural ability to strategize and to be like this problem solver and just be right there with Lyndon Johnson and, just making these game time decisions.
Mm-hmm.
What else were some of her interests, like outside of the environmental movement, outside of civil rights? What were some of the things that you might have come across that maybe other interests that are like lesser known?
Well, some that are probably well known, but that I chose not to spend a huge amount of time on, was literacy. Head Start was one of the signature programs of the War on Poverty, and it's a program that still exists today. She was the kind of, the figurehead for it. It was Sergeant Shriver's program. It was part of the Office of Economic Opportunity. It's interesting. Head Start was, it was one of the things I was surprised at was that some of these just basic social programs that were born under LBJ, which were designed at, literacy and health, at targeting literacy and health and nutrition, were really seen as a threat in some communities. So for example, this is not about Lady Bird, but there were bomb threats against Head Start classrooms in Mississippi. She went and visited Head Start classrooms in every town that she visited when she could. But she always said that it wasn't her most important passion. And so she didn't want to be promoted as being as deeply involved as she was on the environmental front. But that was a big piece of her. The other thing is, she was a campaigner. So in the presidential campaign in 1964, it wasn't just she was in the South, she was all over the country. She was also, as I talked about my own experience being the only woman in the room, she was also very comfortable as the only woman in the room. And in 1964, remember that once LBJ became president, actually in 63, there was no vice president in this country for an entire year, not until Humphrey was inaugurated in 65. So when I look at the images and look at how much she did of the ceremonial and rope line and just kind of meeting with constituents 24/7, it's very the kind of vice presidency role that she was playing in 1964. It's another element. In fact, it wasn't just me that saw this. The female press corps that traveled with her started jokingly referring to her as Mrs. Vice President.
When they left the White House, another one of our questions, when they left the White House, when they left Washington, did they continue to kind of work in lockstep with one another, in this kind of president, vice president, like husband, wife way, or did they each pursue new interests? What happened in their next chapter?
Well, their next chapter began in the presidential chapter. She especially, but Lyndon too, put a lot of energy into building the presidential library and the LBJ School of Public Affairs. Lyndon died in 1973, so he only was around for 4 years once they got back to the ranch. Lady Bird was alive for another 34 years once they left Washington. And in that time, she was able to bring to Austin, Texas, the kind of sensibilities around urban parks and urban swimming holes and nature in the cities that she had wanted to do in Washington, D.C. She was on the board of the Regents of the University of Texas. She was quite involved in the family business as she had been before 1963. And she traveled with her family. So she stayed busy until she began to have a couple of strokes and suffer some other medical problems in the last 10 years of her life.
Did she have foresight about like the current environmental situation we're in now? Did she have foresight about any of the issues that we're talking about today?
I think she absolutely did. I think she had foresight that was unrecognized at the time, because we are talking today about, I mentioned Rochester, I mentioned New Orleans. We're talking about getting rid of highways that divided communities and ruined otherwise thriving spaces. We're talking about that now. We're talking about issues related to housing and human beings, fundamental needs in American cities. We're talking certainly about climate and the environment and how preserving both is so essential. She, at the very end of 1968, was, without using the phrase climate change, starting to think about CO2 emissions, believe it or not. And the Lady Bird Johnson Wildflower Center, which she built in the 1980s outside of Austin, it sounds, again, wildflowers, is that just kind of a girly thing? But I'm sure men like wildflowers too, so I don't want to diminish it. But what in fact it is a serious center for research and education on climate change mitigation and using local plants to mitigate against erosion. And it's kind of a very comprehensive environmental center that she was behind. That's named after her. That's her place.
Mm-hmm. Native plants have a huge, there's a big platform for people talking about those today. So
right.
It's really powerful what she did back then. When you were kind of mining the civil rights documents, and if you were to describe like a civil rights entourage that Lady Bird had, who would be part of her entourage? was Coretta Scott King part of that? Who were her kind of civil rights people that she worked with?
Well, she was on the Whistle Stop tour. The team that she put together were several. Well, one of them was Lindy Boggs, who became a member of Congress, but she was married to Hale Boggs, who was a member of Congress from New Orleans. Lindy was a serious organizer, and she came on to organize the trip along with another woman who somebody should write a book about, whose name was Liz Carpenter. Liz Carpenter was from Austin, and she was a journalist, and she moved to Washington, D.C. as a cub reporter, covered Eleanor Roosevelt in the White House. And when she first came to Washington, knocked on the door of her representative, and that was Lyndon Johnson in the Congress. But Lady Bird was running at the office because it was during World War II, and Lyndon was off in the Pacific or in California. They became fast friends, and Liz Carpenter became, I sometimes think of her as sort of the Johnson's Valerie Jarrett. She was one of, other than Lady Bird, the only person in the White House who could move between the East Wing and the West Wing, and who was very essential in knitting together the political operation between the two of them, between the East Wing and West Wing. So Liz, Lady Bird, and Lindy were crucial on that civil rights tour of the South. Coretta Scott King, Martin Luther King, the leaders of the Black civil rights movement, Lady Bird was cordial with, but it wasn't until after both Martin Luther King and LBJ died that Coretta and Lady Bird began to communicate with one another. In Washington, D.C., on the environmental side of civil rights, she had a very important partnership with the man that became the first mayor of Washington, D.C., whose name was Walter Washington. And he had been the head of the National Capital Housing Authority. He was a light-skinned African-American man who had become very deft at dealing with the white power structure in Washington, D.C., the congressional committees that oversaw his budget. He was her guide into Black Washington. He was the one who collaborated with her around thinking about how to bring basic elements short of representation, because that required the Congress, of empowerment to the Black community in DC.
Mm-hmm. So just a couple more questions before we kind of wrap it up. But one question I have, and you mentioned this just a couple moments ago, was you mentioned Eleanor Roosevelt. There's these power couples in history. We think of like Clementine Churchill and Winston Churchill. We think of, FDR and Eleanor Roosevelt. We think of Abigail and John Adams. Now we have Lady Bird Johnson and Lyndon Johnson. Are there any like current power couples that you think of that kind of have reminded you at all of the way that this couple acted?
Well, I've been, if we stay in the White House and go in reverse chronological order, I've been waiting to see Jill Biden in action, because I believe, and it's actually similar, right? Their trajectory. They've been married for 30 plus years. Biden was in the Senate for many years. Then he was vice president, just like LBJ. Jill Biden is totally schooled in the ways of Washington. She's got her own career, but she's very much on the inside of Biden's political operation, even though we don't see that so much. So I think the Bidens, and the context, of course, is similar too, coming on the heels of, moving this huge infrastructure bill through, dealing with a racial reckoning, coming on the heels of a major political polarization. the Bidens are sort of inheriting a moment that's similar, arguably, to the time that the Johnsons were in the White House. I was very surprised. Now I'm switching to the Obamas. Really surprised. I don't know if anybody here read Michelle Obama's memoir, when she said that there was only one time in all of their years in the White House when Barack asked her to come into the Oval Office during working hours, and that was the day of the Sandy Hook mass shooting in Connecticut. Now, Lady Bird, and I hope you will buy my book because you'll see it in the photographs. Lady Bird was in the White House, in the Oval Office all the time. They were constantly on the phone sending each other notes. She was in there all the time. And the Obamas told us, at least publicly, that they had a very strict wall between work and play, that their work-life balance had been beautifully accomplished. The Johnsons had no such thing. There was no work-life balance. Everything was part of the joint political enterprise.
Yeah, we had a discussion around Nancy Reagan's biography that came out this year, and
did you have Karen Tumulty speak?
She did speak, and you know, there's certain parts of what you're talking about that actually remind me of some of the things that I was hearing about Nancy Reagan as well.
Karen and I are doing a conversation tomorrow for the National Book Festival.
Oh, that's incredible.
Yeah.
My last question is there anybody, you know, in current, you know, in the world right now that, you know, that reminds you in some way of Lady Bird Johnson?
Oh, that might be the only question you asked me, Laura, that I'm not sure I could answer, at least not on the fly. I don't know. I'm sure there is somebody, but none that you know, Lady Bird Johnson, and here I'll go back to something that she wrote. She wrote to another person who was writing a biography of her when she cut off ties with this person. She wrote, "You'll never understand me if you don't understand how totally intertwined my life and Lyndon's lives are with one another." So it's hard to, you know, as much as I've tried to stick to elevate her and place her inside of the Johnson presidency, she's so much part of it that it's hard to find another Lady Bird because there's not another Lyndon.
Right.
I'm sure there are many women who are just as talented as she is. I know that's a fact.
Well, I think from the bibliotherapy perspective, it's a good idea for people to read the book just to kind of think about for themselves, like how they might be able to identify with her, because she sounds like a pretty incredible woman to kind of to read about at night.
She's a consummate multitasker. I think she invented it.
Well, I can tell you that speaking to you tonight has been just such a lovely honor, and it's your book. It received incredible reviews when it came out. And for those who don't know, in the New York Times, you know, this book was compared to the work that Robert Caro had done on Lyndon Johnson, like, and to have that comparison, it was very mind-blowing when I heard them make that comparison, because of what the way that they feel very outwardly about Robert Caro. So I just want to say that, you know, if you haven't had a chance to read this book is, you know, this is the way to go if you want some inspiration right now. So we could go ahead and put it in the chat. Absolutely. We could go ahead and put in the chat the link to buy the book, but you could also give Buxton Books a call. And Julia, thanks for sending us those signed book plates. And thanks for meeting with us tonight. We can't wait to have you back in person and, you know, for everybody to be able to meet you.
Thank you. I had a great time. Thank you all for coming and for your wonderful questions. And thanks to the Charleston Library Society.